Jason Whitmore raised his glass at the lavish Manhattan wedding reception, proudly showing off his stunning model bride while laughing with friends about the quiet little ex-wife who couldn't keep up with his success. The ballroom glittered with crystal chandeliers and champagne flowed like water when suddenly the room went quiet. Outside, a long black limousine rolled to a stop at the entrance. Guests turned as the door opened, and Emily Carter stepped out, calm, elegant, wearing a sapphire silk dress that made the crowd whisper. Jason smirked, until another door opened. A tall man stepped out beside her. Someone gasped, "That's Daniel Ashford." Jason's smile slowly disappeared. The best revenge is not shouting back. It's walking into the room they thought you'd never enter again. The ballroom of the Grand Lexington Hotel shimmered with gold light as crystal chandeliers reflected across marble floors polished so perfectly they mirrored the glittering crowd above them. Waiters in pressed black jackets moved through the room, carrying trays of champagne, while a soft jazz quartet played near the stage. It was the kind of wedding people in Manhattan talked about for weeks, a celebration designed less for love and more for spectacle. And at the center of it all stood Jason Whitmore, smiling like a man who had finally proven something to the world. His tuxedo was tailored to perfection, his posture relaxed, his confidence effortless as he wrapped an arm proudly around his new bride, Victoria Hale. Victoria was exactly what the cameras loved. Tall, striking, with the poised elegance of someone who had spent years walking under flashing lights on runways from New York to Milan. Her white gown shimmered like fresh snow under the ballroom lights, and every guest who passed them offered the same compliment. Stunning. Perfect. A power couple. Jason accepted each praise with the casual satisfaction of someone who believed he deserved every second of it. Near the bar, a circle of business partners leaned closer as Jason raised his glass. "To new beginnings," he said with an easy laugh, the sound carrying through the room. Someone jokingly asked what happened to the first wife, the quiet one whose name had faded from the social pages years ago. Jason's grin widened, the kind of grin that came from a story he'd told many times before. "Emily," he said casually, as if recalling an old inconvenience. "She was never built for this world." The men around him chuckled. Jason gestured around the glittering ballroom, the orchestra, the designer gowns, the million-dollar flower arrangements imported from California that morning. Some people just can't keep up. A few guests laughed louder than necessary, eager to stay on the good side of a man whose real estate company had been climbing steadily through Manhattan's most powerful circles. Victoria smiled politely beside him, though she had heard the story before. Jason Whitmore loved the narrative of his own success, and every success story needed a failure somewhere in the past. Across the ballroom, a wall of tall windows overlooked Park Avenue where the city lights stretched for miles. Traffic moved in slow streams beneath the glow of street lamps. Inside, everything felt warm, controlled, perfectly curated. Jason lifted his glass again, enjoying the moment. For him, tonight was proof that the world had chosen correctly. The right woman, the right life, the right future. But just beyond the tall front entrance of the hotel, something unexpected had already begun to unfold. Outside, a long black limousine turned slowly toward the curb, its polished surface reflecting the gold lights spilling from the hotel doors. The driver stepped out first, walking calmly to open the rear door as pedestrians paused along the sidewalk. Inside the ballroom, laughter continued, glasses clinked, and Jason Whitmore finished telling another story about how far he had come since his first marriage ended. What he didn't know was that the past he believed he had outgrown was only a few steps away from walking straight back into the room. The laughter inside the ballroom rolled on like soft thunder beneath the chandeliers while outside the Grand Lexington Hotel the limousine door opened slowly and a pair of silver heels touched the pavement. Emily Carter stepped out with quiet composure, the cool Manhattan air brushing gently against the sapphire silk of her dress. The fabric caught the streetlight in subtle waves, the color deep and calm like midnight over the Hudson River. For a moment, she simply stood there, breathing in the night. 2 years earlier, she had walked out of a courthouse 3 blocks away feeling as though the entire city had turned its back on her. Tonight, the same skyline looked different, stronger somehow. A hotel doorman opened the entrance with a polite nod, unaware that the woman walking past him had once been the quiet center of the very social circle celebrating inside. Emily's reflection followed her through the polished glass doors and into the warm, golden glow of the lobby. The sounds of the reception floated down the corridor ahead, glasses clinking, laughter rising, the low melody of a saxophone drifting through the air. She recognized the music immediately. Jason always preferred live jazz at his parties. The memory almost made her smile. As she walked toward the ballroom entrance, a young event coordinator glanced up from her tablet and froze for a moment, clearly recognizing her face from photographs that had once filled society pages years ago. Emily offered a calm, polite smile and continued forward. Inside the ballroom, Jason Whitmore was in the middle of another story, one hand resting confidently on the back of a velvet chair while the other gestured casually through the air. His voice carried easily across the small group gathered around him. Victoria stood beside him, radiant beneath the chandelier light, greeting new guests with the polished ease of someone accustomed to being watched. None of them noticed when the ballroom doors quietly opened. At first it was only a few people near the entrance who turned their heads. A whisper passed between two guests, then another. The subtle ripple moved through the crowd the way wind travels across still water. Emily stepped inside without hurry, her posture relaxed, her expression calm. The sapphire dress moved softly as she crossed the marble floor, the gentle sound of heels echoing faintly beneath the music. Several people stared openly now, recognition dawning in their eyes. One woman lowered her champagne glass mid-sip. Another guest leaned toward his companion and whispered something that made her eyebrows lift in disbelief. Jason noticed the shift in the room before he saw the reason. Conversations were faltering. A few heads had turned toward the entrance. Slowly, almost curiously, he followed their gaze. The moment his eyes found her, his smile paused. Just for a second. Emily Carter walked forward with the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing left to prove. She was not searching for attention. She was not asking for permission to be there. She simply belonged in the room as much as anyone else. Jason recovered quickly, the smirk returning to his face as he leaned slightly toward one of his friends. "Look who finally decided to show up," he murmured lightly. But even as the words left his mouth, another sound reached the entrance behind her. The soft closing of a second limousine door outside the hotel. And somewhere near the ballroom doors, a guest suddenly whispered a name that made several people turn at once. Daniel Ashford. The whisper moved through the ballroom like a sudden change in the air. Daniel Ashford. The name alone carried a quiet weight in Manhattan, the kind of name spoken in boardrooms and financial headlines. Near the entrance, a tall figure stepped through the open doors, calm and unhurried, his dark suit sharply tailored, his posture relaxed in the way only truly powerful people seem to move. Several guests turned instantly, recognition flashing across their faces. A man near the bar straightened his jacket. Another guest lowered his phone slowly, as if unsure whether he should be recording the moment. Daniel Ashford paused just inside the room, his gaze sweeping across the chandeliers, the orchestra, the crowd that had gradually fallen silent. Then his eyes settled on Emily. For a brief second, the noise of the reception seemed to soften around them. Emily did not move toward him immediately. Instead, she turned slightly, her calm expression unchanged, as if she had expected exactly this moment. Daniel walked forward across the marble floor, his footsteps steady and unhurried. The quiet tension in the room deepened with every step he took. Jason Whitmore watched the approach with a polite smile still fixed on his face, though something behind his eyes had begun to tighten. Of course he knew the name. Anyone in New York real estate knew the name Daniel Ashford. His investment firm had funded skyscrapers, tech startups, transportation networks. Rumor had it that half the city's future projects waited for his approval before a single steel beam went up. Victoria noticed the shift in Jason's posture but said nothing, her eyes following the approaching billionaire with careful curiosity. Daniel reached Emily and stopped beside her as though the two of them had arrived together all along. His voice when he spoke was calm and warm, carrying easily through the quiet space around them. "I apologize for being a few minutes behind you. Traffic on Park Avenue was slower than usual tonight." Emily's eyes softened slightly as she turned toward him. "That is Manhattan for you," she replied with a small smile. Daniel offered his arm, and she accepted it with effortless familiarity. Around them the whispers grew louder now, spreading through the crowd like sparks catching dry air. Jason felt the shift instantly. The story he had been telling minutes earlier seemed suddenly small against the weight of the moment unfolding across the room. Daniel's attention turned calmly toward the wedding couple. He inclined his head politely in Jason's direction. "Congratulations on the wedding," he said in a voice that carried both courtesy and quiet authority. "I hope we are not interrupting anything important." Jason opened his mouth to respond, but the words hesitated for half a second longer than he intended. That small pause did not go unnoticed. Daniel continued smoothly. "Emily mentioned that you were celebrating tonight, and she thought it would be polite for us to stop by and offer our congratulations in person." Several guests nearby exchanged stunned glances. The phrasing was simple, but the implication was unmistakable. "Us." Jason's gaze moved slowly from Daniel Ashford back to Emily Carter, the woman he had just mocked minutes earlier. For the first time that evening, his confident smile faded just enough for the truth to slip through. Because suddenly the room no longer felt like his stage. And the woman he believed had been left behind had just walked back into his world with the one man whose approval could shape the future of every deal Jason Whitmore hoped to make. The quiet that followed Daniel Ashford's greeting settled over the ballroom like a sudden change in pressure before a storm. Jason Whitmore felt every pair of eyes in the room shifting between him, Emily Carter, and the man standing beside her. He forced a small laugh that sounded thinner than he intended, lifting his glass slightly, as if the moment were nothing more than an amusing coincidence. "Of course not," Jason said, his voice steady but tight around the edges. "It is a wedding celebration. Guests are always welcome." Victoria stood gracefully beside him, her expression polished and controlled, though even she could sense the invisible current that had begun to move through the room. She had heard Daniel Ashford's name before. Everyone in Manhattan had. The man rarely appeared at social events unless there was a reason. The orchestra continued playing softly in the background, but the music now felt distant, like something drifting from another room. Daniel acknowledged Jason's words with a polite nod. His presence carried a quiet gravity that seemed to shift the center of attention wherever he stood. Around them, several guests who had been chatting near the bar slowly turned their bodies toward the conversation, pretending to admire the floral arrangements while listening carefully. Emily remained composed beside Daniel, her posture relaxed, her gaze calm as she looked around the ballroom she had not entered in years. Memories brushed past her like faint echoes. The marble floor, the chandeliers, the soft jazz music. Once upon a time she had stood beside Jason in rooms just like this, smiling politely while investors shook his hand and photographers captured their perfect life. Back then she had believed that loyalty and patience were enough to build a future. Now she understood something very different. Daniel glanced briefly toward the high windows overlooking Park Avenue before speaking again, his tone conversational but deliberate. "I actually spoke with several developers earlier this week about a series of upcoming investment projects in Midtown," he said. His words floated lightly through the air, yet every business mind in the room immediately sharpened its attention. Manhattan real estate moved to the rhythm of capital, and Daniel Ashford controlled more of that rhythm than most people realized. Jason felt the subtle shift instantly. His company had spent the past year chasing funding for a massive redevelopment proposal only 6 blocks from here. The project had stalled while investors waited to see which direction Ashford Capital might lean. Daniel's gaze returned calmly to Jason. "I believe your company submitted a preliminary proposal for one of the parcels involved in the redevelopment zone near 47th Street, he said thoughtfully. Jason's heart gave a small, involuntary jolt even though his face remained carefully composed. "Yes," he replied, straightening slightly. "We are very interested in that opportunity." Daniel smiled faintly, not with arrogance, but with the quiet assurance of someone accustomed to decisions shaping entire skylines. "That is good to hear. Emily told me you have been very ambitious lately." For the first time that evening, Jason noticed the subtle phrasing. "Emily told me. Not someone mentioned. Not I heard about. Emily." The room seemed to grow even quieter as the realization slowly unfolded in the minds of several guests nearby. Emily Carter stood calmly beside the man whose financial decisions could determine the future of Jason Whitmore's biggest project. And for the first time since she entered the ballroom, Emily finally looked directly at Jason again, not with anger, not with triumph, but with the steady confidence of someone who had already walked through the hardest chapters of her life and come out stronger on the other side. Jason Whitmore held Daniel Ashford's gaze for a moment longer than comfort allowed, forcing the calm smile of a man who had spent years negotiating across polished conference tables. Inside, however, something had shifted. The quiet authority in Daniel's voice was not theatrical, not exaggerated. It was the simple confidence of someone whose decisions moved markets. Around them, the guests had grown noticeably attentive, their conversations fading into the background like distant echoes beneath the music. Emily Carter felt the subtle tension ripple through the room, and for a brief moment, she remembered another night years earlier when she had stood quietly beside Jason at a fundraising gala just 2 blocks away. Back then she had watched him speak with investors using the same tone he carried now, proud, assured, convinced the future belonged entirely to him. The difference was that tonight the center of gravity had changed. Daniel turned slightly toward the champagne table where a server had just arrived with fresh glasses and selected 2 with easy familiarity, offering one to Emily before lifting the other lightly in Jason and Victoria's direction. "It truly is a beautiful celebration," he said. "The city does not often slow down long enough for moments like this." Victoria thanked him politely, maintaining the poised grace that had made her famous in fashion circles. Yet even she could feel the subtle recalibration happening among the guests. A few people who had once been clustered around Jason were now drifting a few steps closer to Daniel and Emily, drawn by the quiet magnetism of influence. Jason noticed it as well. The developer standing beside him had just shifted his stance, angling his body slightly toward Daniel's side of the conversation. These small movements were almost invisible to most people, but in Manhattan's business world they spoke volumes. Daniel glanced briefly toward Emily, the gesture natural and unforced, before continuing his thought. "Emily and I had dinner earlier this evening not far from here," he said. "She mentioned that you were celebrating tonight and suggested we stop by for a few minutes." Emily's calm smile remained unchanged, but inside, she could sense the moment settling into place with the steady clarity of sunrise. 2 years ago, Jason had believed she would fade quietly into the background of the city. That version of her had disappeared the moment she realized her value was never meant to be measured by someone else's ambition. Jason adjusted his cufflinks slowly, buying himself a second to recalibrate. "That was thoughtful of you both," he said carefully. "We appreciate the congratulations." Daniel nodded again, his eyes thoughtful as he studied the room, the chandeliers, the clusters of guests who were now openly listening. "Manhattan's skyline has always been shaped by the people willing to imagine what comes next," he said in a reflective tone. "The upcoming redevelopment corridor near 47th Street will change a great deal about this part of the city." Several guests exchanged quick glances. That project had become one of the most anticipated developments in years. Jason's company had publicly pursued one of the central parcels with enormous effort. Daniel's next words arrived with the same calm steadiness that had filled the room since he entered. "We are finalizing the primary investment partners for that project very soon." Jason felt his heartbeat rise slightly despite his composed posture, because suddenly the conversation had shifted far beyond a wedding reception. Emily lifted her champagne glass quietly beside Daniel, the faint sparkle of the chandelier lights reflecting in the sapphire silk of her dress. She did not say anything yet. She simply stood there beside the man who held the future of the project Jason Whitmore needed most. And in that quiet moment the room understood something Jason was only just beginning to realize. Emily Carter had not returned to the ballroom to revisit the past. She had returned standing beside the future. The quiet expectation in the ballroom deepened after Daniel Ashford's last words, as if the entire room had leaned forward at the same moment. Even the jazz quartet seemed to soften their rhythm, the saxophone drifting gently beneath the chandelier light, while every guest silently waited for what might come next. Jason Whitmore lifted his champagne glass again, though the gesture now felt more like a shield than a celebration. He had spent years learning how to navigate rooms filled with investors and competitors, but this moment carried a different weight. Daniel Ashford was not simply another businessman. When he spoke about a project, people listened carefully because the direction of entire city blocks could shift with a single decision from his firm. Emily Carter sensed the tension building around them and allowed herself a small breath of steady composure. The ballroom looked different now than it had earlier in the evening. Conversations had quieted, bodies had turned, and attention had slowly gathered around the small circle where she and Daniel stood beside Jason and Victoria. It was not loud or dramatic. In Manhattan, influence rarely needed to raise its voice. Daniel studied Jason thoughtfully for a moment, then glanced toward the tall windows that revealed the endless ribbon of city lights stretching along Park Avenue. New York has a way of reinventing itself every decade, he said calmly. Buildings rise where old ones once stood. Neighborhoods transform. Ambition reshapes the skyline piece by piece. Several guests nearby nodded faintly, as if he were describing something almost philosophical rather than a business reality. Jason followed the direction of Daniel's gaze toward the windows, though his thoughts had already moved ahead to the redevelopment corridor Daniel had mentioned. That project represented years of planning for his company. If Ashford Capital stepped in as the primary investor, the future of Jason's firm could accelerate overnight. Daniel turned back toward him with a quiet, reflective expression. I appreciate ambition, he continued. It is the reason cities like this never stop growing. But I have also learned that the strongest partnerships are built on more than ambition alone. They require judgment, character, the ability to see people clearly even when circumstances change. The words settled gently into the air, yet they carried a meaning that many in the room understood immediately. Emily felt the subtle warmth of Daniel's support without needing to look at him. 2 years earlier, she had believed her life had collapsed when her marriage ended. She had believed the whispers, the assumptions, the quiet dismissals that followed. But time had revealed something far more powerful than revenge. It had revealed clarity. Victoria stood quietly beside Jason, her composed smile beginning to soften as she realized the conversation was moving in directions far deeper than a casual congratulation. She looked briefly at Emily with a curiosity that had replaced the earlier confidence of the evening. Jason straightened slightly, determined not to lose control of the moment. Well, he said carefully, the redevelopment corridor will certainly require partners who are prepared to move quickly when opportunities appear. Daniel smiled faintly, acknowledging the point without agreeing or disagreeing. That is true. Timing always matters. His eyes shifted once more toward Emily before returning to Jason with calm steadiness. Emily has a remarkable instinct for timing, he said. In fact, some of our most successful investments began with conversations she encouraged me to explore. The ripple that followed those words was immediate. Several guests exchanged surprised glances. Jason felt something cold slide quietly into his awareness. Because suddenly the woman he once believed had been left behind was no longer standing beside power. She was part of the reason it moved. And for the first time since the evening began, Jason Whitmore realized that the future of his biggest opportunity might depend on the judgment of the one person he had once underestimated the most. The ripple of surprise that followed Daniel Ashford's words lingered in the ballroom like the final echo of a bell. Several guests exchanged quick glances while others tried to hide their curiosity behind polite smiles and quiet sips of champagne. Jason Whitmore felt the shift more clearly than anyone. Moments earlier he had believed the evening belonged entirely to him. The perfect wedding, the perfect bride, the admiration of investors and colleagues who had gathered to celebrate his success. Now the center of the room had moved, and with it the quiet balance of power. Emily Carter noticed the tension but did not react with triumph. Instead, she stood calmly beside Daniel, the soft glow of the chandeliers reflecting off the sapphire silk of her dress. She had once spent years standing quietly beside Jason at events like this, smiling when expected, listening while business conversations unfolded around her like a language she was never meant to speak. Back then she believed her role was simply to support his ambition. Now she understood that her silence had never meant she lacked insight. Daniel lifted his glass slightly, taking a measured sip of champagne before continuing the conversation in the same steady tone that had held the room's attention since he arrived. When Emily first mentioned the redevelopment corridor near 47th Street, I was intrigued, he said thoughtfully. It is rare to see someone notice the potential of a location before the rest of the market catches on. Several people nearby leaned closer, unable to disguise their interest any longer. Jason's mind moved quickly, trying to measure every implication hidden within Daniel's calm explanation. You are saying Emily identified the opportunity, he asked carefully. Daniel nodded once. The gesture simple but unmistakable. She did more than identify it. She convinced me to take a closer look. Emily felt the quiet energy of the moment, but kept her voice gentle when she finally spoke. I only suggested that Daniel visit the area one afternoon, she said. The neighborhood has been quietly transforming for years. Sometimes the most valuable changes begin long before anyone notices. Her words were thoughtful, free from any trace of arrogance. Yet for the people listening nearby, the meaning was unmistakable. The redevelopment project that developers across Manhattan had been fighting for had started with a conversation she encouraged. Victoria studied Emily with new attention, her earlier confidence replaced by genuine curiosity. Jason remained composed, though inside the realization had begun to settle like cold water. 2 years ago, he had dismissed Emily as someone who could not keep up with the world he was building. Now that same world appeared to be moving in response to decisions she helped guide. Daniel glanced around the ballroom briefly before returning his attention to Jason. The investment committee will announce the primary development partners very soon, he said calmly. We are looking for firms that understand both opportunity and responsibility. The skyline of New York deserves careful hands. Jason nodded slowly, aware that every word spoken in the next few minutes could shape his company's future. Of course, he replied. Our team has invested significant resources preparing for the proposal. Daniel acknowledged the comment with a polite smile, but his eyes briefly returned to Emily, as if sharing a quiet understanding. Emily lowered her glass slightly and allowed her gaze to travel across the ballroom once more. The chandeliers, the music, the same polished room where she had once felt invisible. Now the atmosphere had changed in a way that no one could ignore. Because the woman who had once been quietly dismissed was no longer standing in the shadow of ambition. She had become part of the force guiding where that ambition would go next. The quiet murmur spreading through the ballroom had changed in tone. It was no longer casual curiosity but the sharp, attentive silence that appears when people realize they are witnessing something important. Jason Whitmore could feel it pressing against him from every direction. Only an hour earlier he had been the center of admiration, the successful developer celebrating his new marriage, surrounded by colleagues who believed his story was still climbing upward. Now those same colleagues were studying Emily Carter with a new kind of attention. Emily sensed it too, though she remained composed, her fingers resting lightly around the stem of her champagne glass. The golden chandelier light reflected softly against the sapphire silk of her dress, and for the first time since entering the ballroom, she allowed herself a quiet breath. Not of victory, but of clarity. Daniel Ashford watched the room with the calm awareness of someone accustomed to subtle shifts in influence. He knew that conversations like this rarely ended in dramatic declarations. Real power often revealed itself through patience. A nearby investor cleared his throat slightly before speaking with careful curiosity. Miss Carter, he said, I had not realized you were involved in the redevelopment discussions. Emily turned toward him politely, her voice steady. I am not formally involved, she replied. I simply noticed the potential of the district when I began studying the property histories along 47th Street. Several eyebrows lifted around the small circle of listeners. Property histories. That was not the language of someone casually observing the city. Daniel gave a faint approving smile. Emily has been studying urban development patterns for some time now, he explained. She tends to notice opportunities long before they become obvious. Jason felt a tightening behind his composed expression. During their marriage, Emily had often spent evenings reading quietly while he prepared presentations and investor calls. At the time, he had dismissed those habits as harmless distractions from the real work of business. Now he realized that the quiet curiosity he once overlooked had been building knowledge he never bothered to understand. Victoria studied Emily carefully. Beneath the soft music and glittering lights, the situation unfolding felt strangely intimate, as though the entire ballroom had become a stage for a deeper conversation about choices and consequences. Daniel set his champagne glass down on a passing tray and folded his hands lightly together. The redevelopment corridor will require more than capital, he continued thoughtfully. It will require people who understand the character of the neighborhoods involved. Investors often forget that cities are built for people first and profits second. Several guests nodded quietly. It was the kind of perspective that separated short-term projects from lasting influence. Jason drew a slow breath before responding. Our company has invested significant planning resources into that district, he said carefully. We believe our proposal reflects both economic growth and community development. Daniel listened politely, his expression neutral. I have reviewed several proposals already, he replied. Some are ambitious. Some are thoughtful. A few manage to be both. Emily glanced toward the tall windows overlooking Park Avenue, where the endless river of headlights moved steadily through the Manhattan night. 2 years ago, she had believed the end of her marriage meant the end of her place in this world. Instead, it had opened the quiet space she needed to discover who she truly was. When she turned back toward the conversation, her calm gaze met Jason's for the first time without hesitation. There was no bitterness there, no anger, only the quiet confidence of someone who had found her footing after being underestimated. Around them, the guests remained silent, waiting to see which direction the future of the city might turn next. The silence that lingered after Emily Carter's steady gaze met Jason Whitmore's seemed to stretch across the ballroom like a thin sheet of glass. No one spoke for several seconds. The jazz quartet continued playing softly in the background, yet even the music now felt distant, as if the entire room had stepped slightly outside the moment. Jason felt the weight of dozens of quiet observations settling around him. Investors, developers, journalists, and social figures who had once treated him as the rising star of Manhattan real estate were now watching a different story unfold. Emily did not look away. 2 years earlier, she would have lowered her eyes, unwilling to create tension in a public room. But tonight her expression remained calm, thoughtful, almost gentle. Daniel Ashford noticed the stillness and allowed the moment to breathe before speaking again. Cities reveal their future slowly, he said, his voice relaxed yet clear enough to reach those gathered nearby. Sometimes the people who see that future first are the ones who have spent time listening rather than talking. A few guests nodded quietly, absorbing the quiet meaning behind his words. Jason forced a polite smile, though his thoughts were racing through possibilities and calculations. His company needed that redevelopment contract. Without it, several planned expansions would stall. And standing beside Daniel Ashford was the one person he had once believed would never play any role in that world again. Victoria sensed the tension as well. She had entered the evening expecting to stand beside a confident husband admired by his peers. Instead, she now watched the quiet confidence of the woman Jason had once dismissed. Emily gently placed her champagne glass onto a passing tray, freeing her hands as she spoke with quiet clarity. The redevelopment corridor has always interested me because it connects 3 very different neighborhoods, she said. Each one has its own history. If the design respects those histories, the project could become something meaningful for the city rather than just another group of towers. Her words were thoughtful, measured, and unexpectedly insightful for many people listening nearby. Jason remembered evenings years ago when Emily had tried to discuss architecture or neighborhood culture with him. At the time, he had brushed those conversations aside, believing they distracted from the larger financial goals he was pursuing. Daniel gave a small approving nod. That perspective is exactly what made me look more closely at the district, he said. Investors often focus on numbers. Emily reminded me that cities are stories as much as they are balance sheets. The remark sent another quiet ripple through the circle of listeners. A developer standing nearby leaned slightly toward his colleague and whispered something under his breath. Jason heard it clearly enough to understand the meaning. They were reassessing him. The man they once assumed controlled every opportunity in the room was now standing opposite someone who had quietly influenced the most powerful investor present. Jason cleared his throat lightly. Our team has studied the district extensively as well, he said, his tone careful. We believe our proposal would bring significant economic growth to the area. Daniel looked at him calmly, considering the statement. Growth is important, he replied. But so is vision. The most successful projects are led by people who recognize potential before it becomes obvious. His eyes shifted briefly toward Emily again before returning to Jason. Emily's instincts in this case have been remarkably accurate. Jason felt the meaning settle heavily into the air between them. Because in the quiet elegance of that ballroom, beneath the chandeliers and polished marble, a new understanding had taken shape among the guests. The woman Jason Whitmore once believed had been left behind had not only rebuilt her life. She had quietly stepped into a position where the future of his greatest ambition might now depend on how clearly she chose to see him. Jason Whitmore felt the room holding its breath around him. The chandeliers still glowed warmly above the marble floor. The orchestra still played its soft rhythm, yet the atmosphere had shifted so completely that even the smallest movement seemed amplified. For years, Jason had walked through rooms like this believing he understood exactly how influence worked. Success meant confidence, momentum, and the ability to move faster than the competition. But tonight the rules felt different. Tonight influence stood quietly beside Emily Carter, wearing calm composure instead of ambition. Daniel Ashford glanced toward the skyline beyond the tall windows again, the distant towers rising like silhouettes against the dark Manhattan sky. "There is an interesting thing about cities," he said thoughtfully, his voice steady enough to carry across the small circle of listeners. "The people who shape their future are not always the loudest voices in the room. Sometimes they are the ones paying attention when everyone else is too busy celebrating themselves." The remark settled into the air with subtle clarity. Several guests lowered their glasses slightly as they listened. Emily remained composed beside him, her expression calm but attentive. Jason forced himself to remain relaxed, though he could feel the careful balance of the evening slipping away from him. He had built his reputation on control. Negotiations, timelines, partnerships, all of it had been part of a system he believed he understood perfectly. Yet this moment felt outside that system. Emily had not entered the ballroom with anger or accusations. She had arrived with quiet certainty, and somehow that had proven far more powerful. Daniel turned slightly toward Jason again, his tone courteous. "Your firm has shown strong ambition in recent years," he said. "Several of your developments have attracted attention across the city." Jason nodded carefully. "We have worked hard to build that reputation." Daniel inclined his head politely. "That is clear. Ambition can build remarkable things. But the developments that endure are led by people who recognize the value of perspective." His eyes shifted briefly toward Emily again, not dramatically, simply acknowledging her presence. Emily understands something many developers forget. The character of a city cannot be forced. It must be respected. Jason felt the quiet meaning of the statement pressing against him. Around the circle of guests, subtle glances continued to pass between investors and developers who were now watching the exchange with sharpened interest. Emily finally spoke again, her voice calm and thoughtful. "The redevelopment corridor could transform that district in ways people do not expect," she said. "But the decisions made now will shape the neighborhood for decades." Daniel nodded lightly. "Exactly. And those decisions will be finalized soon." The room seemed to tighten slightly at those words. Everyone present understood the significance. Jason held his composure, though inside he was beginning to understand something he had not considered before. 2 years earlier, he had believed that removing Emily from his life had simplified everything. Now he realized that the quiet intelligence he once overlooked had been studying the same world he claimed to dominate. Daniel looked at him steadily, the expression on his face calm but thoughtful. "We will announce the lead partners for the project within the next few days," he said. "Our decision will depend not only on numbers, but on the people behind them." Jason nodded once more, aware that every word spoken tonight would echo far beyond this ballroom. Across from him, Emily Carter stood beneath the chandelier light with the same quiet composure she had carried since entering the room. And for the first time since their marriage ended, Jason Whitmore realized something he had never fully understood before. The woman he once believed had been left behind had not disappeared from his world at all. She had simply stepped forward into a position where she could finally see it clearly. The quiet tension in the ballroom did not fade after Daniel Ashford finished speaking. Instead, it settled deeper into the atmosphere, like the stillness that arrives just before an important decision. Jason Whitmore remained standing across from him, shoulders straight, expression controlled. Yet the certainty that had once carried him through every business negotiation now felt less stable than it had only minutes earlier. Around them, the circle of guests continued to expand subtly as more people drifted closer under the excuse of refreshing drinks or greeting acquaintances. In reality, they were listening. In Manhattan's business world, moments like this rarely happened in public, and when they did, people paid attention. Emily Carter noticed the movement but did not react. She simply stood beside Daniel Ashford with the same quiet composure she had carried since entering the ballroom. The golden chandelier light shimmered across the polished marble floor, reflecting faintly against the deep blue silk of her dress. For a moment, she allowed her gaze to travel across the room again. The same room where years earlier she had felt invisible while Jason accepted congratulations from investors and colleagues. Tonight the room felt different. Not because she had come seeking recognition, but because she had finally stopped believing she needed it. Daniel reached for another glass of champagne from a passing tray, his movements calm and unhurried. He raised the glass slightly in acknowledgement of the celebration around them before speaking again in the thoughtful tone that had held the room's attention since his arrival. Manhattan has always rewarded bold ideas, he said. But the projects that truly last are guided by people who understand the city beyond spreadsheets and blueprints. Several guests nodded quietly, recognizing the truth in the observation. Jason listened carefully. He knew this conversation had already moved beyond polite wedding remarks. Daniel was explaining something far more deliberate. The redevelopment corridor will become one of the most visible transformations in the city during the next decade, Daniel continued. It deserves leadership that understands both opportunity and responsibility. Jason cleared his throat slightly before responding. Our proposal reflects that responsibility, he said. We have spent the last year assembling a team capable of delivering a project that benefits both investors and the surrounding community. Daniel inclined his head politely. I am aware of your proposal. In fact, I reviewed it earlier this week. The statement sent another quiet ripple through the nearby listeners. Jason held his expression steady, though the knowledge that Daniel had already examined the proposal raised the stakes of the evening even further. Daniel's eyes moved briefly toward Emily again before returning to Jason. Emily offered an interesting perspective when we discussed the proposal together, he said calmly. She pointed out several opportunities within the district that many developers had overlooked. Jason felt the meaning land more heavily than any direct criticism, because the implication was unmistakable. The conversation about his company's future had already happened, and Emily had been part of it. Emily finally spoke again, her voice gentle but clear. Cities grow in layers, she said. Sometimes the most valuable improvements come from understanding what already exists rather than replacing it completely. Daniel smiled faintly. Exactly. That insight helped shape several of the ideas we are considering now. Around them the guests remained quiet, the weight of the moment settling into the elegant room beneath the chandeliers. Jason Whitmore stood facing the two of them, aware that the future of his most important project might now depend on a perspective he had once dismissed. And as the soft jazz music drifted through the ballroom once more, he began to realize that the quiet intelligence he once underestimated had never disappeared from his world. It had simply been waiting for the moment when he would finally have no choice but to see it. The silence that followed Emily Carter's words carried a new kind of weight. It was no longer the curiosity of guests watching an unexpected reunion. It was the quiet recognition that the balance of the room had changed. Jason Whitmore could feel it in the subtle shift of posture from the investors standing nearby, in the way conversations around the ballroom had slowed as more people listened without appearing to listen. The soft jazz music continued to drift beneath the chandeliers, yet even the musicians seemed aware that something more important than a wedding celebration was unfolding beneath the golden lights. Daniel Ashford studied Jason calmly, the expression in his eyes thoughtful rather than confrontational. He had spent decades in rooms like this, observing how people revealed themselves when circumstances changed. Ambition was easy when success felt guaranteed. Character appeared only when the ground beneath that ambition began to move. Jason straightened his shoulders slightly, determined not to allow uncertainty to show. His voice remained controlled when he spoke. Our firm has spent years preparing for projects like this one, he said. We believe our vision aligns with the long-term development of the district. Daniel inclined his head politely, acknowledging the statement. I believe you are sincere in that goal, he replied. But sincerity alone does not always produce the best decisions. The words were not harsh. They were calm, measured, almost reflective. Yet everyone listening understood the deeper meaning behind them. Emily remained silent for a moment, her gaze drifting toward the tall windows where the lights of Manhattan stretched endlessly into the night. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the quiet clarity that had defined her presence throughout the evening. When I first walked through the streets near 47th Street last year, she said, I noticed something most redevelopment proposals ignored. The small bookstores, the family restaurants, the old theater tucked between two glass office towers. Those places tell the story of the neighborhood. If they disappear completely, the city loses something it cannot rebuild. Several people nearby nodded softly. Even those who had arrived expecting nothing more than a glamorous reception could recognize the truth in her observation. Daniel gave a faint smile of agreement. That was exactly the point she made to me, he said. Cities are not collections of buildings. They are collections of lives. The projects that endure are the ones that respect both. Jason listened carefully, realizing that this conversation had moved beyond competition. It had become something deeper, a quiet lesson unfolding in front of dozens of witnesses. Victoria glanced between Emily and Jason, the realization slowly forming that the woman she had expected to overshadow tonight had instead revealed a strength that could not be dismissed with confidence or charm. Daniel set his empty champagne glass onto a passing tray and looked back toward Jason one final time. Our decision regarding the redevelopment partners will be announced soon, he said calmly. When that moment arrives, we will choose the team we believe understands the city best. Not just its profits, but its people.